Okay, I think we should get going here because CCL starts on time and ends on time. So and we all have other places to go, I'm sure, by 5:30. Everybody's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I'm sure, at this point. So good afternoon, and welcome to the Citizens Climate Lobby 2017 Climate Change and National Security Panel. This is at least the third panel we've had over the years. Before that, I don't know because I wasn't here for national security. This panel is one of three of CCL's 32 panels they're holding here this year, and I think there's 9 going right now. This is one of only 3 that are being live streamed. Recordings of these panels that are being live streamed will be posted on CCL's website following the conference. I'm not sure about the others, but I know these will. This year's panel for national security and climate change will cover 2 areas. One is talking about dealing with climate change as an all-government approach and community, and another as how we should, tips for us and focused on how we should be looking at it from the congressional standpoint and what our congressional staffers and representatives would like to hear from us if we're going to effectively communicate with them about our desires that they take these impacts from the national security seriously. I'm George Kolovec. I've been a volunteer at CCL since 2014. I see the man that recruited me here in the office. I haven't forgiven him yet. I'm co-lead of CCL's Fairfax chapter, and fortunately I have a young, energetic co-lead, and she gets all the work done for the chapter while I'm doing national security things. I'm also liaison for District 11 to a Democrat here in Virginia, not here, but over the river in Virginia, and since June of 16, I've been the lead for CCL's Climate and National Security Action Team. Quick plug for the Action Team, and if we could have the slide up, please. Before I introduce our guest speakers, our Action Team mission statement was updated in May and is posted in CCL Community on the Action Team site for national security and climate change. I also had handouts with it. Some of you may have picked them up at our table here in the tabling room. The Action Team exists to help our liaisons and chapter leads get the tools they need to be effective with their representatives in the talking about national security impacts of climate change. So we can provide films, we can provide guest speakers, we can provide people to come brief and be on panels like we're going to have here, come to events they're having if we're trying to have a group start, and also to talk to them personally and meet with them personally in their offices if they'd like to have a climate expert and someone who's also an expert on the national security impacts, primarily the national security impacts. They aren't all climate experts, but most of them really know their stuff, and they know it in great detail as to what these impacts are. And why the American public should care about it, and as a result, and many already in the American public are becoming aware of these impacts to our national security. And so that is the purpose of the team, and we'll help you frame your discussions and your asks for your meetings, and so at this point, we've had to tear the table down. So if you haven't signed up, you can do that on the community site. We're fortunate today to have a panel of highly distinguished experts in both the national security impacts of climate change and also extensive experience in the nuts and bolts of dealing with Congress on national security matters. I will introduce our guests at the start here and then turn the panel over to them. Their bios are in your program. So in the interest of time today, I've just selected some highlights. We will allow time for questions at the end. There are microphones in both aisles. And so you might, when there's about 15 minutes left to go, start queuing up if you do have questions. And in the previous panels that we've seen here today and in the past, if you aren't in the first 3 or 4, you may not get to ask your question. Without further ado here, our first panelist will be Rear Admiral Phillips, United States Navy, retired, to my right. Rear Admiral Phillips is currently a member of the Center for Climate and Security's Advisory Board. Center for Climate and Security is one of 3 organizations we deal with to help bring the experts to you and to make sure we're staying up on the latest policy and in regard to national security and climate change. Admiral Phillips was a surface warfare officer. She served in every warfare group of the surface Navy: destroyers, aircraft carriers, amphibs, and replenishment ships. She first commanded a guided missile destroyer, the USS Mustin, then later commanded a destroyer squadron, and finally commanded an expeditionary strike group, which included all of the amphibious expeditionary forces on the east coast of the United States. Ashore, she served as the director of Surface Warfare Division in the Pentagon from 2009 to 12, on the Chief of Naval Operations Climate Change and Task Force and Energy Task Force, where she developed and implemented the Navy's climate change adaptation and energy reduction strategies. Ashore, she served as director of the Surface Warfare Division in the Pentagon. We covered that. And served overseas in Guam and Lisbon, Portugal, and operated extensively with NATO and Partnership for Peace Nations. Retiring from the Navy in 2014, she completed her MBA at William & Mary in 2016. During this time, she also chaired, deep breath, the Infrastructure Working Group for the Hampton Roads Sea Level Rise Preparedness and Resilience Intergovernmental Pilot Planning Project. There's an acronym for that, but it's too long too. This was convened by Old Dominion University. This very ambitious project worked to develop a whole of government and community approach to deal with the impact of sea level rise across the Hampton Roads, Virginia region that could be used as a template by other regions facing similar challenges. She will talk about that with great authority here shortly. Now, an independent consultant, Admiral Phillips works to address climate impact on national security at the regional, state, and national level, and speaks about climate security and adaptation strategies to a broad range of audiences. She serves on several nonprofit boards and coordinates an evolving wetlands restoration project in her neighborhood, which is also right down there in Norfolk, Virginia, where they're having the sea level rise issue. She's on many panels. She's been on 2, at least that I know of, in the last couple of months, and has another one coming up. So she's in high demand as a speaker. Fortunate to have all our panelists today. Our next panelist is Colonel Tom Watson, United States Air Force, retired. Colonel Watson is the Director of Government Affairs at the Center for Climate and Security, and there he is responsible for engaging the U.S. government on issues of climate and national security. Prior to joining the center, he served as a senior project lead for climate adaptation and critical infrastructure in the Department of Homeland Security. He produced DHS's first series of climate adaptation webinars, featuring topics such as impact of sea level rise and drought on national critical infrastructure. At DHS, Colonel Watson was also the director of the Infrastructure Coordination and Analysis Office and the first DHS Transportation Team Lead. Prior to joining DHS, Tom served on active duty in the U.S. Air Force for 30 years, retiring in 2004. Assignments included to the faculty of the National Defense University's Industrial College of the Armed Forces here in Washington, and to the Secretary of the Air Force Staff Office of Legislative Liaison. So we're counting on his lessons learned there. Colonel Watson commanded airlift forces during Desert Storm and served as the Vice Commander of Lagos Air Base, Azores, Portugal. A lot of people don't realize how important that air base is to the United States of America. I could testify as a fighter pilot trying to cross the Atlantic how important that island air base is partway. He was a command pilot with over 4,000 hours of flying time. Our final panelist to Colonel Watson's left is Mr. Andrew Holland. Mr. Holland is the American Security Projects Director of Studies and Senior Fellow for Energy and Climate. As an expert on energy, climate change, and infrastructure policy for the last decade, he has worked at the center of debates about how to achieve sustainable energy security and how to effectively address climate change. On the Hill, from 2006 through 8, he served as a legislative assistant on energy, environment, and infrastructure for United States Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska. Following that, he worked for the House Ways and Means Committee, one very important to us for our legislation, and for Congresswoman Rukemia. Andrew is an accomplished writer and experienced strategic analyst. Widely cited in the media on energy and environmental policy, he has spoken about energy security, Arctic policy, and water resources at high-level events in South Korea, Brussels, Washington, London, Berlin, Geneva, and China, and has testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee about America's role in the Arctic. He authored a cover feature article in the June 2016 Scientific American magazine issue titled Preventing Tomorrow's Climate Wars. The concluding paragraph of the 5-page piece is titled, Will the Next President Care? This was written last June. So I looked this up because I'd read it. I subscribed to Scientific American and woke up one morning, got it in the mail, and saw Andrew's name on the cover of the magazine. And I said, wow, I didn't know Andrew was a scientist. So here in closing, he had a 5-page detailed article, feature article. In closing, Andrew suggested with some prescience that the looming question is whether the military's preparation efforts will continue when a new president takes office in January of 2017. The issue of climate change remains frustratingly political, with many Republicans dismissing it altogether. So now that I'm seeing that in Scientific American, I include that's a scientific finding.
Peer-reviewed.
Peer-reviewed. Originally from New York City, Andrew currently resides here in Alexandria, Virginia. So we're lucky to have all of our panels here today. They are all experts, and you'll be hearing much more from them over the years on this issue. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And Admiral Phillips, thank you for agreeing to get our session underway here today and sharing your experience and insights from those challenges that you face down there in Hampton Roads.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you. George, thank you for that very kind introduction, and for your graciousness in tolerating how long it was. Anyway, it's an honor for me to be here at the Citizens Climate Lobby Annual Conference. As George mentioned, I am a surface warfare officer. I drove ships for 31 years, and like my military and experienced panelists here today, I'm an operator. I am trained to view a mission in strategic, operational, and tactical terms, and to do what is required with clear-eyed pragmatism to prepare for and execute that mission. So in the context of what you're going to do tomorrow, I want to leave you with 3 things today. First, the Defense Department takes climate impact seriously. It creates and intensifies real operational risk and global instability. It's a real threat. It is not an imagined political agenda. Second, in the armed forces and in the Defense Department, we have an inherent responsibility to prepare to execute our mission. We take that seriously. It's based on engineering and scientific fact. We gather the best practical information available. We make a decision, we evaluate our risks, and we decide and then execute. Sometimes we refer to that as an OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. Or you may have heard it referred to as plan, do, check, act. But it's a serious strategic operational and tactical preparation. And finally, we believe within the Defense Department that climate change adaptation requires a whole-of-government approach. And, this is the ask, the defense community needs unrestricted ability to plan, evaluate risk, prepare, execute its mission across government, and it needs to be able to include federal, state, and local participants in that planning and preparation. So before I go on, I want to show you a 2-minute film clip of the movie Tidewater, produced and created by filmmaker Roger Sorkin of the American Resilience Project. Tidewater looks at the impact of rising waters on national security as told from the perspective of one community, my community, Hampton Roads, Virginia. Hampton Roads is really a region on the front lines of climate impact, and I think you'll see a little taste of that here in the next 2 minutes. So if we can roll the video. It's not possible to wall off all that water. There's just too much.
That water is the economic lifeblood of this region. That's why the port is here. That's why the military is here.
It's our largest naval base in the world, and we're not going anywhere.
Flooding is impacting all the bases in Hampton Roads.
We have to have sailors that are ready to go to fight our nation's battles.
Pretty difficult to get the people onto the base if they're driving down roads that have standing water on them.
Flooding is happening on sunny days. Constant environmental challenges degrade readiness over time.
The commanding officer has to turn off the electrical power to the piers.
It cancels church, it cancels softball games.
And the stresses add up over time, especially in a military life. It's stressful enough.
The U.S. military, they see the problem. The naysayers are jeopardizing U.S. national security, and they are jeopardizing the U.S. economy.
Facts are that the water's coming up and the land's going down.
Water is the water, and it doesn't matter what your politics are, it still comes in my yard and my basement.
It's a challenge to our mission. It's a challenge to our way of life.
What's our plan that will allow this region to continue to operate?
How can we be an exporter of good ideas to the rest of the world?
That's a real opportunity for this region.
We have the technology, we have the knowledge.
How do you make yourself part of the solution and not simply be a victim?
So that's just 2 minutes. It's actually 45 minutes. But it's a great depiction of what we're actually dealing with there from the perspective of the people who are living with it and dealing with it. And there's a whole lot more stories in it. And so I encourage, if you have an opportunity or hear about a screening, it premiered here at the Environmental Film Festival March 20th. And it's been shown at a few other festivals, won an award in San Francisco, and gradually getting more and more exposure. So. Tidewater. So George asked me to talk a little bit about how climate change kind of impacts our actions around the globe and then pull it into the Hampton Roads region in particular. And so to put it kind of in context, as you saw implicated in the trailer, the rising waters in the region of Hampton Roads, as an example, impact our ability to train. They complicate our logistics. They complicate our ability to actually run our daily operations. And whether influenced by famine, that's one example that's in the news, South Sudan, Yemen, Nigeria, and Somalia, the four worst, consider the worst famines or pending famines on the globe today. These are all places where we have an interest and where we operate. And the challenge is when you work in a country that is experiencing so much climate-impacted stress, that's impacting their government's ability to function, it's impacting their social structure's ability to function, and if you're operating there, it impacts your ability to do your job as well. If there's no food for anyone who lives there, you are probably going to find yourself, in addition to whatever mission you're executing, supporting in some context the needs of the people and the diaspora that are in your area. If there isn't any water, you're going to have to make your own water, you're going to have to bring your own water, and then you're going to find yourself supporting the needs of the people in the region where you're working as well. If you want to turn it to a colder climate, think about the Arctic. We have a different challenge there. Instead of ice, now we have more water. Warmer oceans are seeing activities like cruise ships for the first time proceeding into Arctic waters. That happened last year. It may happen again this year. We have to prepare ourselves now to operate in a region where we have really, as a military, not done a significant amount of operations. We're challenged to understand navigation. It's largely uncharted. Search and water in extreme water temperatures, search and rescue in extreme water temperatures. Just the basic functioning of our equipment. Do hydraulic fluids work? Do we have brittle challenges with pieces of equipment that are not used to being under such extreme climate impact? So all of these are challenges, and all of these take us out of our comfort zone and require us to prepare in new and different ways, and we can't abandon that. We really can't abandon that to a political agenda. So let's talk about Hampton Roads, the front lines of climate impact. What makes it so critical? There are 29 federal entities represented across hundreds of different locations in Hampton Roads, 16 major bases. Of the facilities, 2/3 of federal facilities are Department of Defense, and 2/3 of that is Navy, including national assets that are unique to that region, like Naval Station Norfolk, arguably the largest naval base in the world, and Newport News Naval Shipyard, our only aircraft carrier construction facility, our only aircraft carrier refueling facility, and one of only 2 shipyards in the country that builds submarines. In addition to that, Hampton Roads is home to the Air Force's Combat Air Command, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, major Army and Joint Logistics bases, nearly all the Army's boats. Yes, the Army has boats, lots of boats. Special Operations Forces and training facilities are there. The largest NATO command outside of Europe, Supreme Allied Command Transformation, Coast Guard Atlantic Area Commander, 5th District, and the largest Coast Guard training facility, Jefferson Labs, NASA Langley, and it's the 4th largest commercial port on the east coast of the United States. All these are facilities that cannot easily be relocated. We are experiencing sea level rise at twice the rate of the rest of the East Coast because, as you heard in the trailer, the water is rising and the land is sinking, which is somewhat unique to our specific area. This is a serious and growing threat, not only to military readiness, operations, and strategy, but to the local diaspora. 45% of our economy comes from the federal presence there. 65% of the 1.7 million people who live in the region transfer to another city. There are 17 cities and municipalities. They go to another city to work every day. So there's a great deal of churn and transportation around the region every day. What that means is adaptation planning cannot be done in isolation. Can't do it by city, can't do it by base, can't do it by a specific facility. And what we learned from our pilot project was this is the largest challenge for the region, how to bring 17 cities and municipalities together in a Dillon rule state to collaborate. So some key points: develop common planning standards, federal, state, local. Change them if you need to, but everybody should be planning to the same base flood elevation, the same sea level rise scenario curve, the same vertical datum. Understand and share common data. Collaborate across a consortium of universities for the best possible science and engineering perspectives. And the challenges of developing land use, financing, economic development, and engineering solutions are going to require the best minds, not only from around the region, but from around the world. How do we take all these people at the federal, state, and local level together to envision, plan, and then develop our future? This is a today problem in Hampton Roads, as you saw a little taste of in the movie, but I want to share a few other stories with you. In my work there, I continually encounter people who, as soon as they find out I have anything to do with rising waters, want to tell me their story. So at a Christmas party this year, I met a NATO colonel and his wife. They'd lived in the area for 3 years. They were about to return to Germany. As soon as she found out that I did something having to do with sea level rise, 30 minutes later, we were still talking. She wanted me to know about what it took to learn to drive in this country with rising waters. how she had to go buy a four-wheel drive vehicle to get in and out of her neighborhood under some circumstances, how she had to learn different ways to get where she needed to go during the day, just driving around Norfolk, and she lived near Little Creek amphibious base, if anybody's familiar with that. She was from Hamburg. She talked about the way Hamburg handles stormwater and runoff and flooding, all solutions that really can't be implemented where we are because the water table is too high already. But they were just fascinated with the challenges of thinking about what the tide cycle was going to be, thinking about when a storm was coming and whether or not that was going to be a problem, thinking about, I don't mean a hurricane, I mean a thunderstorm. I mean, a tomorrow afternoon event could see downtown Norfolk flooded to a depth of about 1.5 feet outside the Chrysler Museum, and huge intersections completely impassable, and they will remain that way for some period of time. I know people who have to decide what vehicle to take to work and when to leave based on the tide cycle. Did they do this 10 years ago? No, they did not. I also have some acquaintances who talk openly about having to eventually abandon their home because it's in a neighborhood that floods so routinely. They have made the assumption that by the time they're ready to leave, the house will not have a value that will allow them to sell it. These are things people in Hampton Roads are dealing with now, today. And it has changed in the last 15 years. We've seen much, much more activity in this regard. So really, the region is a crucible. The region is a crucible for the entire range of challenges that we will begin to experience globally with regard to climate impact, but we are certainly experiencing locally right now in this area. We have to take our responsibility for this seriously, and again, from the defense perspective, we've got to plan and operate. We need the ability to do that in an unrestricted fashion, and we need the ability to do it across the whole of government, community, federal, state, and local, because this is a national security issue, and forces that live and work in Hampton Roads operate globally. So I would urge you to think about those things as you go forth to the Hill tomorrow. I thank you very much for your time and your attention this afternoon. And I'd like to turn it over to Colonel Tom Watson, who will talk more about the strategic and political challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I've heard the Admiral speak a number of times on Hampton Roads, and I always learn new things every time I hear her. She's a real subject matter expert on that. I'm not sure that's a title that you'd really like to have, but she is a real treasure on that, so and extremely knowledgeable in that area. Again, George, thank you for the introduction earlier today, and thanks to the Citizens Climate Lobby for hosting this important panel on climate and national security. And a special thanks to each and every one of you in the audience today for taking the time to come to attend today's event. So why does the United States national security establishment take climate change so seriously? The Admiral's given you some hints to that, but let me fill out that picture a little bit further. In March of 2017, the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, in his response to questions posed by the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee stated, "I agree that the effects of climate change, such as the increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others, impact our security situation. I will ensure that the department continues to prepare to conduct operations today and into the future. And we will be prepared to address the effects of changing climate on our threat assessments, resources, and readiness." But this is not a new idea. The national security establishment in the United States, including the military, intelligence, and homeland security communities, has long understood climate change as a national security risk, and as well as the responsibility to prepare for it. Climate change is a threat multiplier which exacerbates existing and prospective threats to the security landscape. The security community has been planning for these risks since the first term of the George W. Bush administration. During that time, we have had integrated climate change risks incorporated into close to 70 unclassified defense, intelligence, and homeland security assessments, strategies, and plans since 2003. In short, attention to climate risk by the United States national security community spans administrations and transcends political party lines. Why do these components of the government that the public would normally associate with war fighting devote so much time and effort to the problem that is popularly perceived as primarily an environmental issue and is often framed as a partisan one? The simple answer: the assessment of climate change as a security threat enjoys bipartisan support in the United States national security community and on the Hill. For the national security community, changes in climate presents problems worthy of attention by those whose primary job is to protect the United States and its allies from harm. The national security community generally considers threats as either direct physical threats to the United States homeland or vital U.S. assets and personnel abroad, or they're considered indirect threats from regions of the world that are either of strategic interest to the United States or whose instability would present direct threats to the United States and its interest. In this context, national security communities consider climate change a threat multiplier, which alters the security landscape and multiplies direct threats to this country. Numerous climate change projections highlight a future of increasing extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, storms, and sea level rise in North America, which could devastate coastal communities, energy facilities, and areas of the United States that rely on predictable patterns of rainfall. This puts U.S. domestic military installations in civilian infrastructure and logistics supply chains essential to these installations at risk, and has become a major concern to the Department of Defense. For example, the DoD has determined that drought, dust storms, forest fires, and rising temperatures are physically affecting our military bases and training ranges across the American Southwest. The DoD has also examined the impact of sea level rise on its numerous coastal military installations, including the highly vulnerable Hampton Roads, which Admiral Phillips has just covered in superb detail. The DoD concluded that these risks are real and increasing. U.S. military installations abroad are also at serious risk of climate-related impact, particularly critical coastal bases on low-lying islands such as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Heightened droughts and unpredictable rainfall patterns due primarily or in part to climate change in areas of the world where the U.S. military operates can also leave armed forces vulnerable to being disconnected from potable water supplies as well as other key logistics. Protecting convoys to transport available water along with fuel has accounted for almost 1/3 of all U.S. Army casualties in Afghanistan in 2007. So just the movement of water within affected regions for our fighting forces considered an extremely dangerous missions for our troops that are engaged in that. Much of the national security community's concern about climate change revolves around its capacity to deal with multiple indirect threats to the United States or its interest, particularly in regions of the world that are key strategic environments for those whose instability could constitute a threat to the United States. For example, climate change threatens to indirectly upset the balance of competing interests in South China Sea, an area of critical geostrategic importance to the United States where U.S. ships carry $1.2 billion in U.S. trade annually. On top of this, sovereignty over parts of the South China Sea are bitterly contested by adjacent countries, and the U.S. and China have perennially competed over its control. The U.S. viewing China's expansionism in the area as a threat to the freedom of navigation, national security, and the security of our key allies in the region. Former commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Locklear, identified climate change as potentially the most disruptive long-term security threat facing the Asia-Pacific region. Admiral Locklear stated in reference to the climate change threats to the growing coastal populations in the Asia-Pacific region, if it goes bad, you're going to have hundreds of thousands or millions of people displaced, and then security will start to crumble pretty quickly. Climate change may also place stresses on food security by increasing the severity, frequency, and variability of crop-damaging events like droughts and floods around the world. Due to the nature of the global food market, this can sometimes result in spikes in world food prices, increasing the likelihood of instability in places that depend on affordable imported foods, such as most of the Middle East and North Africa. This is part of a larger phenomenon that Dr. Troy Sternberg calls the globalization of hazards, where natural hazards in one region of the world can have a significant impact on other regions halfway around the globe. In the case of countries such as Egypt, a strategically significant U.S. partner, such chronic instability due in part to severe food insecurity can fundamentally change the U.S. global security architecture. In the Arctic, which Admiral Phillips has briefly talked about, dramatic changes to sea ice coverage driven in large part by climate change may have a significant impact on resource disputes, given the petroleum-rich seabeds and the ill-defined territorial borders of that area. Lastly, climate change can exacerbate the social, economic, and environmental stresses that plague fragile states, thus heightening the probability of massive population displacements and instability. In Syria, a severe drought from 2006 through 2011, coupled with natural resource mismanagement by the Assad regime and other stresses, led to the displacement of around 1.5 million farmers and herders. Though it could be folly to argue that climate change caused the Syrian civil war, it is clear that the region's plummeting winter precipitation levels were one of the drivers of mass population displacements in Syria due to water and food insecurity, and that the inadequacy of the government's response to that displacement contributed to popular dissatisfaction with the Assad regime. In short, climate change threatens to make fragile states even more fragile, which can lead to the potential for destabilizing violence. It can present direct security challenges to the United States and its allies, as we are observing today. Does the threat of climate change really warrant serious attention in the light of the plethora of other security concerns that we face, such as the proliferation of nuclear weapons and materials? From a U.S. security perspective, the answer is yes. Not least because climate stresses on food, water, and energy systems can make other security threats worse, particularly in fragile and climate-vulnerable regions such as the Middle East, North Africa, Central and South Asia. Furthermore, climate change is what risk analysts would call a high probability, high impact risk, meaning it is likely to occur with a probability running 90 to 97% in the modeling, and will have a large and widespread impact on security. For example, the 2014 Global Risk Report ranked climate change the highest threat along with global financial crisis. There is already a significant high degree of certainty that climate change is and has the capacity to be a multiplier of direct and indirect threats to the United States, and that steps to address that risk are currently warranted. That is why the United States national security planners put time, personnel, and resources into addressing its effects, and have done so across both Republican and Democratic administrations. In this context, climate change as a security risk is not just a narrative or a political talking point. As the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, stated in his written testimony to the Senate, climate change is a challenge that requires a broad, as we've heard earlier, whole-of-government response. The United States military, intelligence, and homeland security communities, indeed the U.S. government as a whole, have an obligation to be prepared for and work to shape the geostrategic security environment and cannot afford to have blind spots in that picture. That is what grounds the responsibilities of preparedness for climate change risk enshrined in Secretary Mattis' statements and in the actions of his predecessors. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today on why the U.S. national security establishment takes climate change so seriously, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the panel presentations. Thank you.
Tom, great stuff. Really, I want to underline and say ditto to that whole presentation, and say that I could have said the exact same thing, but not as eloquently and not as well cited. So I think my role here today is to take off my climate and think tank analyst hat and put back on my old congressional staff hat. I spent 5 years or so up on Capitol Hill in various roles, and had a lot of people like you all come in and talk to me. And I guess I just want to kind of give you some tips and pointers about how that process all works, and what all goes into it, and then how this national security argument about climate change can feed into that, and how your message can help staffers like me to bring that up to the boss and to actually affect policy and affect change. I guess I want to start with kind of a story about how I got involved in climate change, and how I got involved thinking about this issue and understanding this issue. So when I was in grad school, about 12, 13 years ago now, I had a professor who was, did my graduate degree in economics, and he was economist, but he was also very liberal environmentalist, and he did economics of climate change. And so he comes in, and he's really lecturing us, and he's very much the green Sierra Club type with his Birkenstocks on, and he fits the stereotypes that you all know very well. Rides his bike everywhere around, and he was just insufferable. And me being, I had already worked for Republicans on the Hill, and so I'm sitting there in the back, scribbling notes saying this is all wrong, and no, that the science doesn't agree on this, and everything like that. Then I didn't really engage on the issue more, and I came to the Hill, and my degree was in economics, and I was working on trade and budgetary policy. And then the boss came to me, Senator Hagel came to me, and I'd been working for him for about 9 months, and he said, well, we have an opening as an LA, but it's not in these issues. Do you know anything about energy and environment? I said, well, I'll learn. So in Washington, everybody in town wants to meet with congressional staff, so I was able to just pick up the phone and call people all around town working on this issue. Hey, come in and tell me what do I need to know? What do I need to learn? What do I need to know? And they all did. I kind of set up a whole seminar, and you have your lobbyists come in, but you have them from both sides, and you figure out which way is going. And that at about that same time, the IPCC, I guess this would be AR4, so 2007, came out, and they sent a copy of the whole big thing to every congressional office, and it got routed to my desk. And in my spare time, I'm sitting there reading through this, and I'm like, this probably isn't a hoax. There's a lot of people who are spending their whole careers writing about this and putting their names to this and really doing serious, significant work. So for me, evidence changed my mind. Scientific evidence changed my mind, got me to understand it, and got me to see what was going on. And that's important, but maybe not the typical model for how congressional staff works. So the other thing I'd say, and since then I've been working on this issue since then. So 10 years later, I'm still working on it, still understand it. Still am astounded that as many people as do put their names and work on the critical issue here. But 15 years in Washington here would give me, what I'd say is that I'm cynical. And the important thing is that you all are not cynical, or else you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be trying to affect policy on such an important issue. But I'm cynical, and the majority of the staff you're going to meet with are cynical. And frankly, and just be clear-eyed about this. Be well aware of this. They've heard from plenty of people by this point about climate change. They've heard about it. They know the arguments. They know one way or the other. Their side is pretty much predetermined. They know where they're coming down. But that doesn't mean that your role is useless, because politics is about showing up. You know, Woody Allen says 80% of life is showing up. Politics is even more than that. If you don't show up, it doesn't matter how good your argument is, because that says that you can't show up at the polls. You can't show up to get your argument made. You can't show up to fill an auditorium to show your side how strong you are, or show the other side how much power you can have against them. So it's good. It's really important that you all aren't cynical, but to know that the guy that you're talking to, or girl that you're talking to, is cynical. Now, where does this come into on the military and national security side? I would echo what Admiral Phillips says, that what does the national security community need is the ability to plan and prepare for climate change as a national security threat, unencumbered by political outsiders. So, you know, that's actually a pretty easy ask on the Hill these days. Just let the military do what they want to do. That's important. Just let the military go. Let them plan and prepare. They're very good at planning. They're very good at long-term thinking. And actually, the way that you can and should frame this for them is to let's have our political leaders think like the military community. Risk assessment, long-term planning, long-term thinking, monitoring the system and going along that. The other important way to think about thinking about climate change as a national security angle is it gets you into a new bucket on the Hill. There's the environmental greenie bucket that you get put into. Now, actually, I think Citizens Climate Lobby is extraordinarily important that you're coming at this from the conservative angle. This frankly didn't exist when I was on the Hill, and we didn't have this. We, you know, as a Republican, having the environmental groups come in to lobby you was frankly frustrating, because if you did as much as you want to help them or to go along with them, and they'd still support your opponent in the election. So it's important to have real conservative direction coming in on this. So it's great that you all, and there's this whole ecosystem growing up and sprouting up, and that's great and really important. And it's showing that politics matters. And the other side is that narrative matters. And this narrative of national security and foreign policy on climate change, it may not be the most deciding thing, but it gives a member of Congress a narrative. And so when you're meeting with staff, you should be thinking about giving the staffer a couple of nuggets that they can put into their memo to the boss to help him frame a narrative, help her frame a narrative about what, you know, I'm a member of Congress. I know climate change. Most members of Congress are smart enough to know that climate change is real and is happening, and that, you know, maybe they should be doing something about it. But they don't really want to be the first ones to stick their head above the trench line there. So they want to, you know, they need a good reason to do that. So you're there to kind of provide them a little bit of that push, a little bit of that way forward. And to say, hey, look at these serious-minded people who are working on this. And I'll give you an example on this. I didn't work for him, but a real leader in the Senate Republican caucus back in the 2000s on this issue was John Warner, former senator from Virginia, and really a great leader on a whole range of issues, including national security. He was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, but he also wrote the Warner-Lieberman Climate Action Bill. And there was two things that he would talk about as his narrative for why he cared about this. One was his grandkids. He took his grandkids to the national parks that he had grown up going to, and he saw they were different. and he saw that things were changing and that he didn't want to leave a changed world to his grandkids. So he decided it was time to work on that. And then the number 2 argument was about national security. And I know he hosted a field hearing down in Norfolk in 2008. To be able to talk about it and have the national security community talk to him about it through that angle really fed that narrative. Now, you're going to have to, each member has a different narrative for the direction that they're going. And they have to be able to craft that narrative about why they changed their minds. Because there's this whole thing in Washington, oh, you can't be a flip-flopper. Don't be a flip-flopper. Well, I think if the facts change, you should change your mind. Or if you were wrong, maybe you should get right. But they have to be able to provide that narrative for why they changed their mind. So that's your role. That's one of the ways you can do about it. All of this is to say is that, so what? Security arguments are important because they can lead to good action on mitigation. You know, the other thing is that security community needs to plan for this and needs to prepare for it and needs to think about it.